agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Matheny. Hey, Kristen.
Hi, Mike.
So I thought today we had a bunch of great listener questions, and I thought we would try to get to some of those, address some of those. And so if you are ready to go, I thought we just plunge right in.
I am ready. These are amazing questions. I'm looking at them again now.
And some of them are very sort of the moment, and others are kind of broader things that we could do whenever. So I thought it would make the most sense to start with the questions that are kind of more focused on what's going on right now, and then just kind of work our way down and see what we get to.
Okay, sounds great.
All right. Well, I'll start us off.
Okay.
Andrew writes in and asks, after Alan Dershowitz argued that anything a president does in the public interest in the name of his reelection is not impeachable, does this increase the likelihood that the next Democratic president will be able to investigate the president and his children over any concerns of corruption? What do you think? I think it's interesting. Now, I think there are two parts. Obviously, you can either accept or not accept Dershowitz's ridiculous argument, and obviously it's pretty clear what I and anyone who has studied the Constitution at all would come to believe. But the larger point, of course, is that the argument is out there now, and it was made by somebody who used to have a reputation for being a honorable and reputable guy, and on one of the biggest stages there is. And so what does that mean going forward? What do you think, Kristen?
Well, when it comes to what Alan Dershowitz was arguing this week, I had very divided views on it. So I'll take that part of the question first, and I'll just kind of walk you through what I was thinking. So, every day, like most people who, listen to the show and are following along with what's going on, I work a full-time job. So a lot of what happened during the day this week and last week with the impeachment trial, I had to come home and catch up on. And it sort of leaves you at a disadvantage because you don't actually see what anybody says. You have to kind of dig for it. And what you do get at the end of the day is a bunch of pundits who are, on cable news, or they're, writing op-eds in this newspaper, on that website, and they're talking about what was said, and they're painting a picture of what was said, and they're imposing their own views on it, and they're shading it and coloring it in a way that they think is palatable. And I think one of the things that I found particularly frustrating about this is the fact that for a long time I couldn't find exactly what he said, because what I was seeing seemed so divided. So I went back the next day and I looked, and it's funny because all I could think was, Alan Dershowitz, you dropped the ball here, because I think what a lot of Democrats were saying, they were presenting the straw man argument. That was basically, they were presenting what he said as something he didn't say. But I went back and I did find the moment where he said that what the president does is essentially not impeachable. I think a better argument, and the argument that I think I would have made, is that we can't necessarily impeach the president for something that we think he was thinking. And I sort of imagine that that's where he was trying to go with this. But what came out was something very, very different. So the second part of the question, he said what he said, I think, is ultimately the conclusion I came to, and you have to accept it.
To be clear, and to take away all the straw men and so forth, what he said was, and I think you'll agree with me on this, the essence of what he said was, if the president has not committed a crime, a statutory violation of the law, and if he believes that what he is, the non-criminal act he is performing is in the best interest of his getting reelected, which he also believes is in the best interest of the country, then it is not impeachable. So, basically, the president can do anything that's not a crime, so long as he can make any kind of a rational argument that it's for the country and not for him. Because what Dershowitz pointed out before said, if if Trump had made some sort of agreement about getting like $10 million for a Trump
Personal
hotel.
financial gain.
Yeah.
Right. That was what he said. And I followed that. I understood that point, even though the rest of it kind of got garbled, I think, and it was a poor argument. It's not the argument I would have made, but it was the argument that he made. But in terms of increasing the likelihood that the next Democratic president would be able to investigate the president and his children over any concerns of corruption, I don't know. I don't know.
How could it not? And that's the whole point to me.
Yeah.
That's why that's such a dangerous argument, because if you're just saying, well, the president can't be held to account for anything that just doesn't happen to be in the statute books, I think that's clearly at odds with what the framers intended for impeachment and removal. And so therefore, I just think that's what surprises me, is that so many of the people who are glomming onto this argument are people who you would think would care deeply about what the framers thought, but apparently their loyalty to present day political outcomes is greater than their loyalty to the framers.
I think this makes me question. Looking at this question, this makes me question, in my mind, how this will impact other situations where something like this arises. Because as much as people want to point fingers at Donald Trump, and again, I'm not necessarily comparing him to other presidents, but I think it's hard when you consider the implications of impeachable offenses. This sort of quid pro quo stuff that the Democrats are alleging has happened before. I mean, this is something that happens in foreign policy. And I think that, and I can't remember if it was, it might have been Marsha Blackburn, somebody made a statement after one weekday this week, I think it was her. She was making a statement that anytime that there's a foreign policy argument that the other side doesn't like, they're going to try to impeach the president. And I don't think that that's true. But I think that a different way we could take this is, how are we going to fix this issue in the future? Because this is something that presidents have been doing for a long time. I mean, I just read an op-ed the other day that was written in, I believe, 2014, that called President Obama the king of quid pro quo. And I think this is something that has happened, at least in recent history. And so I think that what Alan Dershowitz says in this whole trial, in essence, brings up a lot of points that we need to probably reassess. I mean, that's probably the best answer I can give.
I'm going to agree and disagree. I certainly agree that, the whole idea of quid pro quo is something for something. And so, yes, when we do things in foreign policy, when we work with other countries, we expect something for something that we give them. That's how could it be other than that? So I think it's a straw man and disingenuous for some Republicans who are saying that this is the same as that. Yes, it isn't the same in that something was being asked for in exchange for something else, but that's not what Democrats are alleging. What Democrats are alleging is that the something that was asked for was a personal political favor. And that's what makes it problematic, to say the least, and I would argue impeachable, actually. And so conflating those two things, I think, is disingenuous, and that's what on the left, I think a lot of people are upset with hearing that. Well, it happens all the time. No, it doesn't.
Well, then how would you characterize? Let's go back to the height of the Clintonian Democratic Party, approaching 2016, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. And there were all of these allegations that the Clinton Foundation was receiving all of these kickbacks, and that there was sort of this quid pro quo exchange. I mean, I think it was pretty well supported. It was something that was never adjudicated. It was something that was never really brought up. I think it's funny, because when I first started hearing a lot of this talk about the Clinton Foundation, or even Joe Biden sort of negotiating this sweetheart deal for his son, sort of some of these things, I do think it raises some of the same issues that we're raising now with President Trump, where there's sort of this personal and or in the case of the Clintons, a political favor that's being exchanged for some foreign policy, I guess, decision, or in some cases money. I mean, I do think that it's the same thing. It may not be the exact same set of circumstances, but I do think that that's what Republicans are trying to argue. And I do find it frustrating when, I think a lot of Democrats are sort of painting Donald Trump as this corrupt president, and this is the first time this has ever happened. I don't think that's the case. I believe this has happened before. And I think this happened in recent history. But again, we're not talking about that. We're talking about what happened with Donald Trump. And like I said in the Saturday show, I think what Lamar Alexander said when he chose not to vote in favor of witnesses is spot on. Yes, something happened and it was wrong. And I think it's wrong for Republicans to pretend like they didn't think it was wrong under President Obama or President Clinton or President Bush, whatever. Because I think there's a lot of this divisiveness going on. People saying, well, it was wrong before, but it's not wrong now, or vice versa. And I think if we're going to hold our noses, to the fire, and we're going to sort of rid the executive office of this sort of level of corruption. Now, what better time than now? But this is something that can't be opportunistic depending on who's in office.
Yeah, well, and it's really too bad that the regulatory body that's in charge of investigating a lot of these election claims, the FEC, is unable to act because the Trump administration has just decided to not appoint enough members for it to fill vacancies so that it can act. And I think that is absolutely a huge problem. And that's not something that happened under the Obama or the Clinton administrations. But yet President Trump apparently just doesn't see the point in appointing FEC commissioners. And I think you would agree that we need an FEC that actually can investigate and take action on some of these allegations, regardless of.
FEC? Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And again, like I've said in the past, I don't agree with everything President Trump does. I don't agree with him, saying the things he said in the call to the new Ukrainian president-elect. But I don't know. I think it speaks to bigger issues about quid pro quo. I think either side pretending like this doesn't happen and things like this don't happen. And to some extent, there's not personal gain always behind. I mean, I think it's impossible that you would rise to the level of president of the United States and you wouldn't be getting some sort of personal gain, whether it's political. Dershowitz mentioned financial personal gain. I think it's questionable when you're talking about the things like the Clinton Foundation and stuff like that. In this case, it seemed political in nature. I think in the case of Obama, and sometimes Bush, it seemed political in nature. But I think the question moving forward is, what are we going to do about it?
All right, moving on. You want to take our next question there, Kristen?
Yeah. So, okay. So there's a question that's asked, and you probably figured I would ask about this because the whole idea of social media fascinates me, and it's sort of the realm that I work in every day. But Trump's social media presence really fascinates me because I have very mixed emotions about it. So, CR Bowen 44 asked on our subreddit. Does the next president basically have to have an active social media presence? And will the usual briefings and addresses seem too distant and elitist and not as accessible if he or she isn't active on social media in the way President Trump is? I think that's a great question and pretty timely. What's your take?
Well, and also there were actually a couple of questions on there kind of related to that was Terry's question about whether, this kind of behavior becomes the new normal. And of course, that's social media and otherwise. But I don't, maybe this is the triumph of hope over experience in this sense. I don't know, but I certainly hope not. I think that Donald Trump is able to pull off things, for better or for worse, almost always for worse, that normal people can't, because he is Donald Trump, because he has a lifetime as a real estate huckster, because he has his own damaged psyche and personality, and he can do these sort of things that would just not come off as authentic or not get the same sort of traction if a normal, differently damaged president, because I think they all have something wrong with them probably, were in the office. So no, I hope that Donald Trump is kind of an outlier in this sense, and he just happened to be the wrong guy at the right time, if you will, to take advantage of this. But that we will see, regardless of who wins, well, obviously, if he wins in 2020, but regardless of who's president after Donald Trump, we're going to see a return to a less crazed Twitter social media presidency.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up question to that, because this is something I've thought about. I mean, if you put aside sort of the entertainment value of his Twitter feed, which is thoroughly entertaining. I mean, I don't always like what he says, and I think it's kind of kooky, but to say the least. But it is entertaining. But putting that aside, um, let me ask you a question. If Donald Trump were to wake up tomorrow, this will not happen, I guarantee. But if you were to wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going to go about this all differently, and he were to roll out daily briefings, and he were to sort of bring back more frequent press conferences, and he were to deliver more addresses directly to the people and not necessarily on Twitter, would you put more stock in that? Or would that mean more to you?
Well, to me, not necessarily. If he keeps on lying in the same way that he does and inciting the sort of polarization that he actively seems to revel in, no, it wouldn't make any difference at all what the forum is. But if he decided to behave like a decent human being, yeah, then that absolutely I'd put more stock in what he had to say. Anytime a liar stops lying as much, I'll try to give him more benefit of the doubt to the extent that there's a track record. Absolutely.
Interesting. Okay.
So, before we get to our next question, Kristen, I want to just thank our sponsors for today. Our first sponsor is Empower. And if you are interested in saving a lot more in 2020, well, Empower can make that a reality, because with Empower, saving and managing your money, just dead simple. They have a set it and forget it autosave function. It lets you put in your weekly savings target. Then every day, Empower studies your income and spending and automatically moves the right amount of money into your savings account, where, of course, you're going to be less likely to spend it. And that's the goal. In addition, Empower can actually negotiate your phone and cable bills for you, which I think personally is really cool. And they've also have live human being coaches who you can text for individualized recommendations. So if you want to save big this year, do yourself a favor, download Empower, that's EMPOWER, in the App Store or the Play Store. I have, and so have over 650,000 other people. It's a lot of people. And even better, Politics Guys listeners, hey, you get $5 when you use offer code Politics Guys and reach your savings goal. Visit empower.me/politicsguys for more details. And also SaneBox. I talk about them before because really it transformed my ridiculous inbox, which just you wouldn't even want to see. As your email comes in, SaneBox keeps only the important messages in your inbox. Everything else gets directed, that distracting stuff, to your Sane Later folder. And that means, hey, right away, you know what you have to pay attention to now and what stuff can wait. There also are a bunch of other great features. I love Sane Black Hole, love the name, where you can put messages from those annoying folks you just never want to hear from again. And Sane Reminder, super useful. It lets you know if someone hasn't replied to your email by a certain date. And best of all, you can use SaneBox with any email client or phone anywhere you check your email. So see how SaneBox can remove distractions from your inbox and make it just a better place to be with a free 2-week trial. Visit sanebox.com/politicsguys today to start your free trial and get a $25 credit. That's sanebox.com/politicsguys. Okay, so our next question for today is from, I guess it's from Scott. Yeah. Scott wants to know, and Scott wants to know, always wants to know, what consequences we believe are in order for those who were involved in seeking and obtaining the FISA warrants, given the findings by both the Inspector General and the FISA court itself that false information was used and exculpatory information was withheld from the court. Why don't you take this first, Kristen?
Well, do you say FISA? I say FISA.
Oh, it's
like
FISA?
tomato,
Okay.
tomato.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. It's like GIF or GIF, right? Okay, I think you're right. Yeah.
I have no idea. I've heard both. I was like, well, I don't want to just start saying FISA, and it sounds like I'm trying to correct because I don't know what is correct. But so I figured I'd see a question from Scott on here at some point, and it would have something to do with this. I have to sort of a 10,000-foot view of this question when it comes to FISA warrants and FISA court and the FISA judge. There have been several points along this journey with what's happened with obtaining the FISA warrants where I've had to stop and ask, why do we even have a FISA court?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of Republicans have asked that. I know some Democrats who have asked themselves this, like, why is this a body that exists? And I think that, what's happening now, we have, obviously what comes to mind is Carter Page. Now he's suing because of what happened to him. But, the question is, given the findings by both the IG and the FISA court itself that false information was used and exculpatory information was withheld from the court, I don't know what the outcomes will be. I hope that we sort of see the end of the FISA court. There's a part of me that thinks that it's just this totally unnecessary layer of government that really impeded this process and sort of wronged people like Carter Page. But to be honest with you, I'm more interested in hearing what you have to say, because I'm not sure what your opinion about the FISA court is and FISA warrants.
Well, yeah.
Democrats.
Well, I do believe that there is a need for a FISA court. There are certain instances where that secret process needs to be in place for national security reasons. So I support the existence of a FISA court. But because of its secrecy, that means that the standards have to be so much higher, which means that the penalties for people who would use that secrecy to their advantage to, do things like, for instance, present false information and withhold exculpatory information. I think that those people, anyone who has been shown to have done that, number one, needs to lose their job, and number two, needs to go to jail. And not just the fine. I mean, we need the penalties for abusing the public trust in this secret proceeding like this need to be so severe that even the thought that you would get caught doing this would just make you say, there's just no way I'm going to do that. I'm not interested in spending 20 years at Leavenworth or something. So I think we need to crack down incredibly hard. I think there needs to be a thoroughgoing congressional investigation of the whole system. I know that Director Wray has talked about changes and so forth. I think that's not enough. I would love to see just a huge congressional investigation of this, because I think what happened with the FISA court, I think what clearly has been shown to happen is tragic and horrific and absolutely needs to be changed.
Yeah. And, another point is that I think a lot of people didn't even realize that the FISA court existed, which kind of goes along the lines of it being so secretive, and that, the standard does need to be set higher. I think it was something that was sort of swept under the rug for a long period of time. And it was funny when all of this information about Carter Page and this, this obtained dossier and the exculpatory, everything that was going on, I think people started to finally take notice and realize that in some case, I guess in more extreme cases, like in mine, I realized, well, what, you looked into it and you think, well, why does the FISA court exist? And so you start to investigate why it exists and why they do issue warrants and why any of this is happening. And I guess to your point, you have a less extreme view, is that it should exist, but that we need to be setting the bar a little higher. And I think that's important to note, that like people didn't even know that this body existed.
Yeah.
And people, savvy political people, didn't know it existed. It kind of came out of nowhere. I remember when I'd heard of the acronym FISA, and I actually had to look up and see what it meant when this news started to break a few years ago, because I had no idea what FISA stood for. And so, I think to some extent you're right. I think that what you're putting out is more likely to happen, I guess, to answer the question. But
yeah.
I guess in a perfect world, according to my view, I would like to see it gone.
I get that, certainly, but I think if we are going to have secret courts, then the standard needs to be incredibly high.
Right. So I guess we'll move on to the next question, which is an interesting one from Stabicon. So Sabacon asks, what do you see as the possible outcome for the Democratic Party? Are they going to continue bending to the pressure from the vocal far left and setting the agenda to legislation that they will not be able to pass? So that's sort of question one. Are they going to be able to maintain the majority in the House? What will the court look like with another 4 years of Republican control of the White House and Senate? Assuming the failure to remove Trump and his reelection, will we just have another 4 years of impeachment efforts? It's a lot of questions, but hopefully you can kind of tackle them, as somebody who is, I guess, who would not like to see this scenario play out.
God, no.
Your opinion matters. So go ahead.
Well, I actually, I'm sort of conflicted because on the one hand, I think that there's sometimes a good reason to talk about legislation that will not be able to pass because the word I'll use is normalizes it. It gets people thinking about it. And so maybe you introduce something knowing that it won't pass today or next year, but it all of a sudden makes it a part of the conversation and it doesn't seem so incredibly far out there, like with something like, say, a universal basic income, which, now all of a sudden is part of the conversation in a way it wasn't, 5-10 years ago. And so I see a value in doing that sort of thing, introducing legislation like the H.R. 1 for the People Act, which is a sweeping set of institutional reforms, which I love for many reasons, or even something which I don't love as much, and which I dislike for some reasons, like the Green New Deal, because it gets people, it's a platform for it. But that being said, if that's all you do, then that's hugely problematic, obviously, because then you're just giving up possible incremental changes in the right direction for pie in the sky things that don't happen. So that's kind of my conflicted view on that. I think we need a little bit of both. Overall, Congress exists to move the country forward, I think, and to pass legislation in the interests of the people. And so while it's important to throw out those moonshots every once in a while, you need to keep your eyes focused on what can we do for the people right now. And so I think we need as much of that as we can get. And I think with Nancy Pelosi in charge, we're going to continue to see that, which is, I think, largely what we've seen out of the Democratic House. In terms of maintaining the majority, my guess is that the Democrats are going to be right around even in 2020. They're going to be holding a lot of seats that they picked up from Trump-leaning districts. I wouldn't be surprised if they lost a couple of those, but I don't see a swing so big where they don't lose their majority in the House, though some people would say you nominate Bernie Sanders and all of a sudden a lot of moderate House members maybe fall by the wayside. But I think it's going to stay a Democratic majority, though maybe slightly smaller. And what the court will look like with another 4 years of Republican control of the White House and the Senate, oh my God. Well, Donald Trump has already appointed, I think at this point, more judges in not quite 4 years than President Obama did in about 8.
In 8,
so, yeah, it's going to be pretty bad from my perspective, which, of course, I would assume the question's being asked because to point out the progressives, hey, wouldn't you like a better shot at getting more balance in the courts for judges who are going to be around for 20, 30 years? And yeah, I get that. So it's a percentages game. We talked about this on the Saturday show. If Bernie Sanders is president, he's going to appoint judges that are going to be a lot like the judges that Joe Biden would appoint, at least people who would be able to make it through a Republican Senate, which I'm pretty sure it's going to be. So, there's not much of a difference there. But of course, I would say the probability of Joe Biden beating Donald Trump is higher than the probability of Bernie Sanders. So do you roll the dice on that? If you're a progressive who feels like Joe Biden is just going to be a different type of awful, maybe you do. Maybe you do. I'm more of a centrist, so I don't roll the dice on that. But I get the reasoning there. All right. Let's see here. Moving on, we have ARC teacher, and some of the names a lot of these questions are from the bipartisan politics group, and I know I practically gushed about it, but when somebody suggested we set up a subreddit, I thought, geez, I don't know, and it's a pain in the butt and all that, but I am so glad I did because it is often one of the highlights of my political day, going in and reading the comments and so forth. It's been really great. So thank you all of you just been part of that group. All right. So our teacher asked a question that really, I love this question.
I knew you would. I
Yeah.
saw it, and I thought Mike is definitely going to ask this question.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
If you had to narrow down your political perspective or philosophy to a set of 2 to 3 dominant principles or understandings, what would they be, and what would be number one? And that I love the questions that really get me to think about what my first principles are. And so here's what I came up.
Okay.
Principle number 1, people are basically good. Number 2, people are basically weak. Number 3, people often vastly overestimate their own expertise and intelligence. Those are my 3 main principles. And I think that leads right into my ideology. Because I believe that people are basically good, I'm ultimately a fan of democratic government letting people decide. But because I believe that people are basically weak, or in many cases weak, God knows I am, that I know that it's important to have strong institutions. It's important to build in incentive structures so that people's weaknesses don't overtake them, which is why I'm not a libertarian, because it seems to me that libertarians far too much downplay the weakness that people have inherent in them, and they are not just rational utility maximizing machines. And finally, that idea that people tend to overestimate their own brilliance and intelligence, especially smart people, that to me argues for incrementalist government, not trying to do too much at once, because you get the smartest people in the room and they want to do big, important things. And then all of a sudden the law of unintended consequences come in. And that's why I'm a Berkey. So I think from those 3 principles, you can pretty much get my entire political philosophy.
I think that's pretty good. I think that pretty much highlights who you are politically, at least as I know you. So I am actually just seeing this question for the first time now. I was, looking through, so I wasn't as prepared to answer this, but I immediately thought of some, I guess, some political philosophies that sort of sum up how I feel. And I also love questions like this because, frankly, most of us don't think about this on a day-to-day basis. And another thing that we don't think about is how much we change over time. I mean, as I'm sitting here and I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about how I was 15 years ago as a student, a high school student, and then a college student. And, I've always been a registered Republican, but I think one of the things that's changed over the years is how Republican I am, or what type of Republican I am. It's changed as I've gotten older, and things have happened in my life, and I've become, as you've said, more and more jaded, I guess. And I've seen how government really works, and I've participated in the way government works and in campaigns, and so I think my outlook has changed. But I think the first thing I would say, and this is you mentioned libertarianism, and this is going to sound very libertarian, I guess. But I think the first statement I'd make is that people are best served when they are free and also autonomous. So I don't necessarily assume that people are weak. I think that there are weak people, but I also think that there are strong people. I think that that's not for the government to decide. I think that's I'm all about individual liberty, individual freedom and autonomy, especially when it comes to political choices and to choices that affect our daily lives. So I think that that's probably the most important overarching political philosophy. I've said I have a Republican friend of mine who, again, is a different kind of Republican than I am, and I was kind of going back and forth with her. We were debating about putting ourselves into boxes, and I it's funny because saying you're a Republican or a Democrat or whatever puts you into a box. But, I think really partisanship is very, very nuanced. And so I think this is going to differ from not just from Democrats to Republicans, but just amongst party lines, or I should say within party lines. And so that's something that I believe. The other thing that I would say sort of dictates my own political philosophy is just the word acceptance, not necessarily of how things are politically, but I think one of the things that's happened to me as I've gotten older is that I've become more accepting of the fact that most people don't think like me. I don't think like most people, and that's okay. At some point, I mean, that's why we do this that's why I do this podcast, is because I feel like we should come together and talk about these things, and that there's really there's forward momentum when we do come together. And I think there are lots of missed opportunities, and it's a shame that we miss them.
Yeah.
But in government, there are lots of missed opportunities to open up dialogue and to be civil and respectful and to come to conclusions, to work towards goals together. I mean, I have someone in my family who is the complete polar political opposite of me. And this happened years ago, but we had a conversation, and at one point she looked at me and she said, we actually have a lot of the same goals. We just have different ideas of how to get there.
Yeah.
And I think that if I could choose a second overarching philosophy, it's that we sort of do have to come together, and we do have to work towards some bipartisan goals. So I think that the first one is sort of my first place, that I think people are best served when they are free and autonomous, especially to make those personal choices and political choices. And then the second is that ultimately we have to find a way to come together. I think those kind of sort of shade my political ideology.
Yeah. I think in the end, you have a little more faith in the rationality of people than I do.
So, I probably do.
But yeah. And also, I wonder the extent to which my being, raised Catholic focuses in on that whole weakness of people, sort of, we're all filthy sinners, that kind of thing. I don't know. But anyway, okay, let's move on to who do we have next here?
Robbie.
Okay.
Speaking of filthy sinners. So Robbie writes, I consider myself right politically, but I am also an evangelical Christian that borderlines on considering myself a never Trump Republican. I'd be interested to know what you guys think of a significant majority of evangelicals not only tolerating Trump by, in many cases, enthusiastically supporting and defending him.
Yeah.
I have thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely have some thoughts on. I get the argument for kind of holding your nose and supporting Donald Trump. Because if it seems to me for a lot of evangelicals, one of the big issues, if not the big issue, it often becomes the abortion issue. And if your first principle is that abortion is the destruction of a human life, and you feel that there's one party that's, willing to countenance that and another party that isn't, well, then if literally, I guess, millions of lives are being destroyed, are being killed, how could you not just hold your nose and support the lesser of two evils in that sense? I get that argument, and I disagree with that first principle, but from that, I understand that. But I guess it's harder for me to accept the sort of enthusiastic support of such a patently amoral man. The message that sends, I think, that the end justifies the means, and that just seems like about the most Machiavellian, at least Jesus kind of line that I could imagine. And so, honestly, to me, I think it's just people who want to feel better about their decision, and oftentimes the way to do that is just to say, he's my guy full in, and I just don't want to have to deal with the conflict, the inner turmoil. So I'm just going to decide that everything he does is wonderful.
I actually agree with you on just about everything that you said, if not everything you said. But I have some thoughts about this too. So I consider myself a Christian, although not an evangelical Christian. But I know many evangelical Christians who have wrestled with this, and some of them are never Trumpers, and some of them aren't. Some of them are wholehearted Trump supporters, and I think this is something that a lot of them wrestle with. I think it's something that a lot of them wrestled with in 2016. Most of these people supported Ted Cruz, and they didn't all support Ted Cruz, but I'm trying to think of my closer friends who are evangelicals who ultimately voted for Trump and support him now. They were supporting Ted Cruz. And you look at you look at some of the things that, for example, Ted Cruz has said about Donald Trump. He's a pretty staunch Trump supporter at this point, and I think he's fallen in line for probably some of the reasons that you laid out. And at the risk of sounding a little detached, because I can't necessarily identify with this demographic, I think that this is the rationale that they're using, is that ultimately I have these goals. And I think, again, to my point that I spoke about earlier, I think that a lot of us fit into different categories, and we have different, a hand in this box and a foot in this box. And I think people sort of prioritize what is important to them. And for a lot of evangelical Christians, what Trump personifies is more important to them. And I'm not saying it's good or it's bad, it's just what they believe, than the outcomes. And I think to some people it's not that way. I think they look at, what's coming down the road, and they see a far worse future for themselves. And they obviously, it doesn't make them any less faithful or more faithful. It just, they've prioritized things differently. So yeah, I have some thoughts about that. But this is something I that I've asked a lot of evangelical Christian friends who have supported Trump, because it's confused me too. I don't come from that same place, and so I'll continue to ask them, especially
Yeah.
as we get closer to 2020. I think it's something we need to ask.
Well, and I think too that there are, like with anything, there are evangelical Christians who I would call Christian. And then there are, like in any group, there are evangelical Christians who are just horrifically bad human beings who call
Yeah.
themselves evangelical Christians,
Sure.
and that's a whole different story. But I
Yeah.
think we got time for a couple of more questions. So
Yeah.
next we have Heather, who wants to know what publications we read and why we read them. And I like, Heather, that you focus on reading, because honestly, and maybe my FISA thing gives you that clue that I get almost no news from TV because I just can't. And so for me, the only broadcast sort of news that I tend to get at all is a few minutes in the morning when I'm making coffee. I'll have NPR on, and that's for like literally 10 minutes, if that, and it's mostly local stuff with the occasional news break thing. But my day almost always starts out with the Associated Press, because I found it to be the most straight ahead, just the fact sort of thing. And that's where I go, and I just want to know what happened in the last day. From there, my daily news routine goes next to the Washington Post, and usually over lunch, I'll read through the Post and annotate various articles and so forth, generally for the show, or even when I'm not doing the show. It's just a habit that I have now. I used to use the New York Times for this purpose, but I found that the New York Times just declined in a lot of ways, and I think the Post is a lot better. For opinion stuff, I like Bloomberg's opinion page. I think they have made an attempt over the last few years to hire some really good folks on both the left and the right. And it's I found it to be really useful. Also, I check out the Wall Street Journal's editorial page and their opinions. I like the Atlantic and yeah, that's obviously left to center. Vox, I have some problems with, and I just have to roll my eyes a lot. But they also do a lot of good kind of wonky explanatory stuff if I can just sort of filter through some of their, progressive craziness sort of stuff. New York Magazine has a side site called The Intelligencer, which I love for political commentary. Andrew Sullivan writes for them, who I love, and Jonathan Chiat writes for them as well, who I think is great. And then finally, I love Tyler Cowen's Marginal Revolution blog. And so there are some other places, but those are the places I go all the time, every week, without fail.
Yeah, I love this question, and I love it for the same reason, because this listener focuses on news that we read, which is important. But I've said on this show that I try to absorb as much. I'm like a constant absorber of information, not just news, but just anything remotely interesting. I absorb it. You can often find me at work. I always have headphones on, and I'm just constantly listening to podcasts. And in the car, that's all I do. I listen. I read and I listen to a lot of the same things that you do. I love NPR. I also listen to NPR. The other two other podcasts that I listen to are Left, Right, and Center, which is, I think, KCRW. And it tends to lean a little more progressive, I'd say. The arguments presented tend to swing a little bit more left. I think it's because the podcast is actually produced in Los Angeles. And then I also listen to other political podcasts. The Ben Shapiro Show is one that I usually tune in for, not just because I agree with Ben Shapiro. Sometimes I don't agree with Ben Shapiro, but I think his take on things is usually pretty interesting. In terms of what I read, my go-to is also the Associated Press. And a lot of times when I prepare for these shows, and, I voice my frustration at trying to find just pure journalism. I just want a timeline. I just want numbers and data. And, and I find that the AP is usually a really good source for that. In grad school, I just constantly relied on the AP, and I continue to do that for that sort of unbiased take on things. My other go-to that I have subscribed to for years is the Wall Street Journal. Love the Wall Street Journal. I think a lot of conservatives do, but to me, I think the Wall Street Journal does a really good job, especially with their opinion pieces, of sort of laying things out in a fairly balanced way, although it does tend to swing a little bit to the right. I do also read The Economist when I can. That's sort of a second tier something. If I have time, I read it. And so the other publication that I read, and it's an online publication, is something called Governing. And because I'm interested in public policy, what I love about Governing, if you don't read it, you really should. But it's basically an all policy bipartisan publication. So they talk about whatever is going on in terms of domestic policy, foreign policy. They unpack it. But what I love about it is that it really is truly bipartisan. And I don't think you can say that about a lot of publications nowadays. And then, of course, just in terms of like trying to get the story, the Associated Press, like I said, the Wall Street Journal, I rely on Politico pretty heavily, which tends to swing left. But like I said, I read everything and I watch everything. In terms of what I watch in cable news, I watch a little bit of everything. I've had a lot of people say, well, you probably just watch Fox News all the time. That's not true. We bounce around. I watch Fox News. I watch CNN. I watch network news. For a long time, I didn't watch network news, and I've kind of come back to it, especially during the impeachment trial, just to see, what kind of the pulse of the nation, what people are thinking. So, yeah, I guess I'm kind of a news.
Yeah.
A newsy person, but
glutton for punishment. I also wanted to mention a couple other conservative sites that I often go to. I don't think a 2-day period certainly doesn't go by where I don't check out National Review. That's dating back from my conservative days, but I subscribe to their daily newsletter. I also subscribe to the New Republic's daily newsletter as well. Sometimes they come together and just sort of fight it out in my inbox there. But also, if somebody is looking for a good source of conservative news and they don't want to pay for a Wall Street Journal subscription, and I get that, I would definitely recommend the Washington Examiner. I think they do some good work. Their opinion page is definitely tilted considerably to the right. But if you think that all conservative news, aside from the Wall Street Journal, is sort of junk daily news, it's not the case. I would say check out the Washington Examiner, because they play it pretty straight when it comes to the basic news, and they definitely obviously have the right of center editorial opinion. But I trust them to the to a fair extent, and I do check them out on a regular basis as well. All right, well, that actually went a little longer than I thought. So why don't we leave it? Once I start thinking about, things I read, I think we're both kind of omnivores in that sense. But
we are.
Yeah. But anyway, so we hope you enjoyed the answer to that question and all of our other questions. And we do really appreciate your support. And if you would be interested in getting ad-free versions of all of our shows as a Patreon supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. We have other stuff there as well. Check it out. If you want to get in touch with us, we're at mail@politicsguys.com. There's our bipartisan politics subreddit, our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page, and we are on Twitter @politicsguys. If you're not already a subscriber to the show, we would appreciate if you could subscribe, and also to share shows with people, friends, enemies, cohorts, you name it. We'd just share it. That would be great. Thank you. The executive producers of the Politics Guys, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, and Daniel Toe. Today's show is produced by Chris Matheny and Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.